the year was long in the medieval world. The days were often measured not in minutes, but in tasks completed. From sunrise to sunset, life revolved around labor, the tending of fields, the feeding of animals, the gathering of fuel, the mending of tools. But as the year wound down, and the warmth of summer faded, the peasant world shifted. The sun set earlier. The winds grew sharper. The green fields grew pale, brittle, and brown. Winter was coming. And for the medieval peasant, winter was not simply a change of season. It was not simply a shift in wardrobe or a reminder to close the shutters. It was something heavier. It was something colder. It was survival itself. One can picture it. A small village, perhaps of a few dozen homes. Roofs of thatch, walls of wattle and daub. Smoke rising in faint streams from the crooked chimneys. A quiet settling in the air, as though the whole world were exhaling slowly. The fields that had once been full of noise and labor were now still. The tools, once used to reap, now rested in corners. And the people, who had once lived by the cycle of planting and harvesting, now turned their minds toward another task. How to endure the coldest nights. The cold itself. We must remember, there was no central heating. There was no switch to press, no boiler humming in the background. Heat had to be gathered, tended, nurtured like a living thing. And the cold was not simply chilly. It was biting, seeping, lingering. The kind of cold that crept into bones. The kind of cold that stiffened fingers, numbed toes, and made every breath visible in the air. A medieval peasant would have known the cold not as an inconvenience, but as a constant companion. It entered through gaps in the walls. It slipped beneath doors. It rattled the shutters. It lingered inside, even when the fire burned. The nights could feel endless. The sound of the wind outside was a reminder of just how thin the walls of one's home truly were. And as families settled for the night, their first thought was not of comfort, but of preservation. The homes. The typical peasant home in medieval Europe was small, often a single room. The walls were made of wattle, woven sticks, plastered with daub, a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and dung. The roof was thatch, dried reed stacked and tied thickly, but not perfectly. There were gaps. There were drafts. Floors were often of packed earth. Cold, hard, unyielding. When frost came, it crept across that earth floor like a second skin of ice. Some houses had simple wooden shutters. Others had none. Glass was rare and too expensive for peasants. Windows were often just open holes, sometimes covered with cloth, parchment, or oiled skin to block the worst of the wind. Inside, a hearth was the center of life. It was not only the place to cook food, but the only source of warmth. Some homes had chimneys, though in the early Middle Ages, many did not. Smoke would rise freely, filling the home before finding its way out through a hole in the roof. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything, to clothing, to bedding, to the very air. Imagine lying down at night, on a bed of straw, with smoke faint in the rafters above. The crackle of a low fire to one side. The hiss of wind outside the walls. The earth floor cold beneath. This was the world of the medieval winter night. The bedding. Beds, if they could be called such, were simple. Straw was the common mattress. Laid out in a wooden frame, or sometimes simply heaped on the floor. Over time, the straw would flatten, grow dusty, harbor insects. It would need replacing. Blankets were not thick, fluffy, or plentiful. Wool was common, but not cheap. Most peasants had only a few woolen coverings, and sometimes none at all. Instead, they used what they had: cloaks, old clothing, animal skins if they were lucky. Families often slept close together. Parents, children, sometimes even grandparents, side by side. Not out of choice, but out of necessity. Shared body heat was one of the most reliable sources of warmth. It was common, too, for animals to be brought inside. Cows, sheep, goats, or chickens might share space in the peasant home during winter. Their bodies added warmth. Their breath, their movement, their very presence, made the room less bitterly cold. It is easy to imagine the sound of a cow shifting in the straw, the faint cluck of a chicken, the steady breathing of a family huddled together. All beneath a roof of thatch, with the winter wind beyond. When we think of home today, we may think of insulation, of walls built to keep out the chill, of windows designed to seal in warmth, of comfort, carefully manufactured. But for the medieval peasant, the home was something else. It was both shelter and struggle. It was protection, but it was also porous. It kept out the rain, most of the time. It kept away the wind, though not entirely. And in winter, the home became the stage upon which the daily battle with cold was fought. The structure. A peasant's house was most often built from what the land itself could provide. Stone was valuable, and rarely used for ordinary folk. Instead, the walls were of wattle and daub. Thin rods of wood, woven together like a basket. Plastered with a thick mixture, clay, earth, straw, sometimes dung. Layer upon layer, dried by the sun, hardened by the air. From a distance, it looked simple. Up close, one could see the texture, ridges of straw, cracks from drying, patches repaired year after year. The roof was thatch. Bundles of reeds or straw, layered thickly, tied down tightly. It looked soft, even inviting, but it was heavy work to build and maintain. Over time, birds might nest in it. Moss might cling to it. Rain might soak through, slowly, drop by drop. In winter, the thatch froze stiff with frost. It glittered white at dawn. When the thaw came, it dripped steadily, adding dampness to the earth below. The floor, too, was of earth. Packed down hard by many feet, it was uneven, sometimes muddy, sometimes dusty, always cold. A scattering of straw could soften it, a little. But when frost ran deep into the ground, that cold rose from beneath, and there was little to be done. The space. Most homes were small. One room, perhaps two. A single space for eating, working, sleeping. The hearth fire at the center, or along one wall. A hole in the roof to let the smoke rise. Furniture was scarce. A bench, perhaps, roughly hewn. A table, worn and uneven. Chests to hold clothing or tools. Beds, if there were any, were rough frames filled with straw. There was no separation of spaces as we might expect today. Privacy was rare. Family life was lived close, shoulder to shoulder, day and night. At one end of the home, animals might be kept in winter. A cow or two. A goat, perhaps. Chickens, scratching softly. Their warmth added to the air, their breath rising in small clouds. Their presence was normal, unremarkable, part of the rhythm of life. The walls and drafts. The walls were never perfect. Daub cracked. That shifted. Wood warped. Gaps allowed in drafts. The wind found its way inside, whispering through corners, rattling shutters, creeping across the floor. Children might stuff rags into the cracks. Straw might be pressed against the edges of doors. But the cold always returned. At night, lying awake, one might hear the sound of the wind outside, and feel the faint breath of it brushing one's cheek. Even with a fire, the far side of the room might be cool, almost icy. He did not linger long. Light and smoke. There was little light inside a peasant's home. A small window, if any, covered with oiled cloth or thin parchment. Glass was too rare, too costly. In winter, the short days meant long hours of dimness. The fire gave light, but also smoke. Without a chimney, smoke gathered in the rafters, hanging in the air, seeping into lungs, eyes, clothing. Candles were precious. Rushlights, made of reeds dipped in fat, burned quickly, unevenly. So most work was done by firelight, flickering and low. Shadows moved across the walls, across the faces of those gathered. Imagine the scene. The orange glow of embers. The faint outline of tools resting nearby. the slow rising of smoke, drifting toward the roof. The room half in shadow, half in haze. Smell and sound. The medieval home had a smell of its own. Wood smoke, always. Damp earth from the floor. The musk of animals, if they were inside. The faint scent of straw, of wool, of stored grain. It was not unpleasant, but it was strong. Clothing absorbed it. Hair carried it. It became the smell of winter life itself. The sounds were quiet, but constant. The crackle of fire. The shifting of straw. A cough, perhaps, from smoke or cold. The low murmur of voices, softened to save strength. And outside, when the wind rose, the creak of wood, the rattle of thatch, the long whistle of air across the village. Daily maintenance. The home required care, constant and simple. Walls patched with fresh daub when cracks appeared. Thatch repaired when leaks formed. Ashes swept from the hearth. Floors freshened with new straw. Children often helped, gathering reeds, carrying mud, fetching water. It was work that never ended, but that held the family together, day after day. In winter, this care became urgent. A gap in the wall meant not only discomfort, but illness. A roof that leaked meant damp bedding, and nights spent shivering. Every repair was a defense against the long season of cold. The hearth as center. Above all, the hearth was the center of the peasant home. By day, it was where meals were cooked. By night, it was where warmth was sought. The fire was not only physical, it was symbolic. It was life itself. The hearth gathered the family. Around it they ate. Around it they worked in the dim hours. And around it they drew close at night, seeking whatever heat remained. Even when the fire burned low, embers glowing faintly, the hearth was a comfort. The faint orange light, the steady heat, the sound of crackling wood. All these reminded the peasant family that, for the moment, they were safe within their home. And so the medieval home, though small, though simple, though filled with draughts and smoke, was a place of endurance. It was the thin barrier between the biting cold outside and the fragile warmth within. It was the backdrop against which winter survival was played out year after year. One can picture it still. The low walls of wattle and daub. The roof of frost-stiffened thatch. Smoke drifting lazily from the hole above the hearth. A family huddled together, close to the fire. The world outside frozen, silent, and dark. And inside, a fragile circle of warmth, holding fast against the night. When we think of warmth in the medieval home, we must think of the fire. It was the heart. It was the center. It was the single source of comfort in a world otherwise ruled by cold. There was no furnace humming quietly in the background. No steady flow of heated air. No switch, no dial, no radiator. There was only the fire. It had to be built. It had to be fed. It had to be guarded carefully. And when winter came, it had to be kept alive. Gathering the fuel. To have fire, one must have fuel. And for peasants, fuel was not always easy to find. Wood was the most desired. Branches gathered from hedgerows. Twigs collected from the forest floor. Sometimes, if allowed, larger logs cut from trees, though forests were often controlled, and peasants faced restrictions on what they could take. In many villages, lords claimed ownership of the woods. Peasants could gather fallen branches, perhaps. But cutting down a tree without permission could mean a fine. Sometimes, it could mean worse. And so they gathered what they could. Children walked the lanes, filling bundles with sticks. Women collected brushwood while tending animals. Men carried heavier loads when they returned from the fields. When wood was scarce, other fuels were used. Dried dung, shaped into patties, stored against the wall. Peat, cut from the ground in certain regions, stacked in blocks, left to dry. Crop waste, straw, or chaff, sometimes burned quickly when nothing else could be found. Each piece of fuel was precious. Each spark was valuable. Fire was not wasteful. It was careful, deliberate, measured. The building of fire. At the center of the home, the hearth waited. Stone sometimes lined it. Sometimes it was simply a bare patch of earth. The fire was lit with care. A spark from flint and steel. Tinder of dry straw, of moss, of bark shavings. The first tiny flame coaxed into life with breath. Then twigs added gently. Then sticks. Then larger pieces. Slowly the fire grew, until it crackled with steady light. The smoke rose upward, seeking escape. In homes with chimneys, it passed through the flue. In older homes, it drifted freely, filling the room before finding its way out through the thatch or the hole in the roof. Eyes watered. Clothing absorbed the smell. But the fire was life. And so the smoke was tolerated, even welcomed. Keeping the fire alive. It was not always easy to light a fire from nothing. And so peasants tried not to let it die. At night, before sleeping, they would cover the embers with ash. This kept the coals alive, glowing softly through the hours of darkness. In the morning, the ash was brushed back, the embers stirred, a breath added, fresh kindling laid. The fire would leap again, reborn from the coals of the night before. If a fire did go out, a family might borrow a flame from a neighbor. A burning stick carried carefully across the village. Or a coal nestled in a pot of ash, kept alive until it reached another hearth. The fire was not just a tool. It was a shared treasure. It was a bond between families, between households. It was the silent thread of warmth running through an entire community. Cooking at the hearth. The fire was not only for warmth. It was also for food. A pot hung on a hook, swinging gently above the flames. Inside, porridge simmered slowly. Grain and water, sometimes a little milk, sometimes a scrap of meat, sometimes nothing more. Flatbreads cooked on the hearthstone. Soups bubbled, flavored with whatever roots or herbs could be spared. On rare days, meat roasted, filling the room with scent, a feast in itself. Cooking was slow. It was patient. Meals took time, and fire was the measure. A stew thickened as the logs burned down. Bread baked as the embers glowed. Time itself was marked by the crackle of wood, the fall of ash. Fire and family. In the evenings, the family gathered by the fire. The warmth drew them in. The light gathered them close. Children sat on the floor, listening to the hiss of the flames. Parents mended clothing, spun wool, carved wood, their hands moving slowly in the glow. Stories were told, softly, over the crackle. Songs hummed, low and steady. The fire was company. It was protection from the night. It was a reminder that even in the coldest season, warmth could be made, if only for a while. The dangers. Yet fire was not without danger. A spark could leap into straw. A roof of thatch could ignite in moments. Water to quench flames was not always nearby. A fire that burned too freely could mean disaster. And so there was caution. Ashes managed carefully. Logs placed deliberately. Children warned to keep their distance. The balance was delicate. Enough fire to warm and feed. Not so much that it destroyed the very home it sustained. Symbol and ritual. In many ways, fire was more than fuel. It was a symbol. A flicker of life in the heart of winter's darkness. Church rituals blessed the new fire at Easter. Communal bonfires marked festivals. Candles were lit on holy days, small reflections of the great hearth flame. In daily life, the hearth was where prayers might be said quietly. Where blessings were murmured over meals. Where thanks was given, not only for food, but for the fire itself. It was steady. It was constant. It was fragile. It was sacred. The fire at night. At the end of the day, as darkness pressed against the walls, the fire dimmed. Logs reduced to glowing coals. The room fell into shadow. Only the faintest light flickered across the faces of those preparing for sleep. The embers pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. A reminder of warmth, still present. a promise that it would return in the morning. And as the family lay down together, wrapped in wool, in straw, in cloaks, the last sight before eyes closed was often the hearth fire, glowing steady in the dark. Thus the hearth fire was more than flame. It was the center of medieval life. It was warmth against the winter. It was food against the hunger. It was light against the darkness. And it was hope, fragile but enduring, against the long, cold nights of the medieval world. When the nights grew cold, when frost traced its fingers across the land, the medieval peasant turned to clothing. Clothing was not simply fashion, not simply a mark of status. It was protection. It was insulation. It was survival. There were no closets filled with dozens of choices. There were no quick purchases from distant places. What one wore was what one had. And what one had was shaped by the limits of labor, of land, of season. The base layer, closest to the skin, was linen. Not the fine linen of nobles, smooth and white, but coarse linen, rough and practical, woven from flax. The tunic was simple. A long shirt, reaching the knees, sometimes longer. Loose sleeves, loose body, tied with a cord at the waist. It was worn day after day. It was washed when possible, though winter made washing difficult. It grew worn, it grew patched, but it remained. Linen breathed. It absorbed sweat. It softened, slowly, with use. It was the layer that touched the skin, always there, the base of every outfit. Wool, the winter's gift. Over the linen came wool. Wool was the fabric of the medieval world. Sheep provided it, year after year, and peasants spun it, wove it, wore it. A woolen tunic. A kirtle. A gown. Longer, heavier, thicker than the linen beneath. Wool trapped air. It held warmth. Even when damp, it offered some protection. In winter, it was the shield against the cold. Colors were muted. Browns, grays, earthy shades. Dyes were costly, bright colors rare. But warmth mattered more than brightness. Cloaks and mantles. Above all, peasants prized cloaks. A simple rectangle or semicircle of wool. Fastened with a pin, a clasp, or simply knotted. Cloaks were versatile. They could be worn by day, while working. They could be wrapped tightly at night, serving as blankets. They could shield against wind, against rain, against snow. The cloak was not only garment. It was shelter. It was bedding. It was a mobile hearth, carried on one's shoulders. Hoods and head coverings. The head loses warmth quickly. And so hoods were common. A piece of wool, cut and sewn, covering head, neck, shoulders. Sometimes attached to a cloak, sometimes separate. Hoods framed the face, leaving only eyes, nose, and mouth exposed to the air. They shielded against drafts. They kept the cold from biting ears and throats. Underneath, simple coifs or caps might be worn. A layer of linen close to the scalp. Easier to wash than wool, softer against the skin. Thus, clothing was not luxury. It was not fashion. It was defense. It was the armor of winter, as vital as fire, as vital as shelter. Wool, linen, leather, straw, simple things, woven and shaped by hand. And yet, together, they were the thin line between comfort and misery, between life and death. When we imagine the medieval peasant, we must imagine them clothed not for display, but for endurance. Wrapped against the wind. Led against the frost. Gathered close in the night, garments doubling as blankets, as shields, as companions. And so, through the long cold, the peasant remained clothed, wrapped, preserved. Not in wealth.